The dry wind that scoured the plains of Redemption, Kansas, tasted of dust and distant rain that never seemed to fall. Elias Thorne tasted it every day. It was the flavor of his life, gritty, persistent, and promising little but more of the same. He stood on the splintered platform of the train station, his knuckles white where he gripped the brim of his sweat-stained hat. The noon sun beat down, making the iron rails shimmer like silver snakes. Inside his worn coat, a letter from the Matrimonial Society of the West crackled, a fragile promise of companionship and, more importantly, help. He had ordered a wife the way he ordered seed from the catalog, based on practical need and a list of desired attributes. Plain, the advertisement had specified, of strong constitution, familiar with farm life, God-fearing and hard-working. He pictured a woman with broad shoulders and capable, chapped hands, a woman whose face was pleasant enough but wouldn't turn heads or cause trouble. He didn't need trouble. He had enough of that in the form of unforgiving soil and a mortgage note held by a man in town with a smile as thin as a razor's edge. What he needed was a partner in survival. A plume of black smoke appeared on the horizon, a smudge against the vast, bleached blue sky. The distant chuffing grew into a rhythmic, ground-shaking roar. Elias's gut tightened. This was it. The 12:15 from St. Louis. He straightened his shoulders, a futile attempt to look like a man whose future wasn't hanging by the thinnest of threads. The train screeched and hissed to a stop, steam billowing across the platform. A few drummers and a family with 2 mini children disembarked. And then, she appeared. The woman who stepped from the carriage was not plain. She was the furthest thing from plain Elias had ever seen. She moved with a fluid grace that seemed out of place in the dusty, pragmatic world of Redemption. Her traveling dress, though simple and gray, couldn't conceal the proud set of her shoulders or the lean strength in her frame. Sunlight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, which was pinned up in a severe but elegant knot. But it was her face that stopped the air in his lungs. High cheekbones, a determined chin, and eyes the color of moss after a rainstorm. Those eyes were not demure or hopeful. They were watchful, assessing, and held a shadow of something old and weary. She carried a single, battered valise. Elias was certain there had been a mistake. This woman was not meant for a life of pulling weeds and milking stubborn cows. She looked like she belonged in a fine parlor in some eastern city, or perhaps on the stage of a theater. He watched as she scanned the small crowd, her gaze missing nothing. It swept past him once, then snapped back, her eyes narrowing slightly as they took in his worn work clothes and the tension in his posture. She held a small piece of paper, and after a glance at it, she began walking directly toward him. "You're Elias Thorne?" Her voice was low and clear, without the lilt he'd expected. It was a voice that didn't waste words. He could only nod, his own voice having abandoned him. She stopped a respectable distance from him, her expression unreadable. "I'm Josephine Galloway, from the Matrimonial Society." "Well, that's one way to meet." Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. Josephine Galloway. The name on the letter. It was her. The society hadn't lied about her name, but plain and familiar with farm life seemed like a gross miscalculation. He finally found his tongue, the word scraping its way out of his dry throat. "Ma'am." He reached for her valise, a gesture of ingrained politeness. Her fingers brushed his as she released the handle, and a jolt, like static on a winter's day, passed between them. Her hands were firm, the skin smooth, but for a peculiar, hard callus along the side of her index finger. It wasn't the callus of a hoe or a needle. "My wagon's over here," he mumbled, turning away from her unsettling gaze. He led her toward the battered buckboard and his old mule, Clementine, who flicked a lazy ear in their direction. The contrast between the elegant, self-possessed woman and his humble rig was almost comical. As he loaded her small bag, he saw 2 men loitering outside the saloon across the street stop their conversation to stare at her. Their grins were predatory. Elias felt a hot surge of something he couldn't name. Annoyance, maybe. Protectiveness. It was absurd. He didn't even know her. "Get in," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. The ride out to his homestead was a study in silence. The wagon wheels groaned in the dirt ruts, and the sun beat down relentlessly. Elias kept his eyes fixed on Clementine's hindquarters, acutely aware of the woman sitting beside him. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, constantly scanning the rolling, sun-scorched hills as if expecting something to appear. There was a tension in her stillness that belied her calm exterior. This was not the posture of a woman looking forward to a new life. It was the posture of a woman watching her back. His farm, when it came into view, did little to break the tension. It was a stark testament to his struggle. A small, unpainted cabin, a listing barn, and fields that were a patchwork of hopeful green and stubborn, dusty brown. A few chickens scratched near the porch, and a lean dog with ribs showing lifted its head and gave a half-hearted tail wag. "This is it," he said, the words feeling like an apology. "The Thorn place." She took it all in, her expression unchanging. "It's honest land," she said after a moment. The observation was so direct, so devoid of pity or disappointment, that it caught him off guard. He helped her down, and for a moment, his hands rested on her waist. She was solid, real, and smelled faintly of lavender and train smoke. He pulled away quickly, his face flushing. He led her inside the cabin. It was one room, meticulously clean but sparse. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and his own cot in the other. A faded quilt, his mother's handiwork, was the only splash of color. This was the life he was offering. A shared room, endless work, and the company of a man who spoke more to his mule than to people. "The bed is yours," he stated, gesturing to the proper one. "I'll take the cot. There's a privy out back. The well water is sweet." He was listing facts, building a wall of practicality between them. She set her valise down by the bed. "What are the chores for tomorrow?" The question surprised him. He'd expected tears, or at least a falter in her composure. Weeding the vegetable patch, mending the south fence where the cattle pushed through, milking Bessie before sunrise. "All right," she said, untying the ribbon of her bonnet. "Where do I find the mending tools?" And so began their strange life together. Josephine, she asked him to call her Joe, rose before he did, the smell of coffee and frying bacon rousing him from his cot. She moved about the small cabin with an economy of motion that was both efficient and mesmerizing. She never complained. She learned to milk the cow, her hands surprisingly strong and steady. She weeded the garden with a relentless focus, her back straight, her bonnet shielding her face from the sun. But the woman Elias had ordered and the woman who now shared his home were 2 different people. The ordered wife was a phantom of simple needs and plain features. The real woman, Jo, was a puzzle. She was a tireless worker, yes, but there were inconsistencies he couldn't ignore. The way she walked, with a balanced, quiet tread, more like a hunter than a farmer. The way her eyes, even when she was looking at him, seemed to be watching a point over his shoulder. And she never, ever spoke of her past. When he asked once where she was from, she simply said, "East," and the finality in her tone shut down any further inquiry. He found himself watching her. He watched the play of firelight on her face as she sat mending his shirt in the evenings, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched the effortless way she hoisted buckets of water from the well, a task that should have been a strain. He started to notice small things. She always chose the chair at the table that faced the door, and she startled violently at unexpected noises. A backfiring wagon in the distance, a branch snapping in the woods. Elias was a man of routine and order. Joe was a disruption, a mystery living under his own roof. He had wanted a simple farm wife to bring predictability to his life. Instead, he had a gunslinging beauty, though he didn't know that part yet, who had brought with her an unnerving sense of suspense, as if they were living in the quiet moment before a storm broke. He was more unsettled than he'd ever been, and for reasons he refused to examine too closely, more alive. The first real crack in her carefully constructed facade appeared 3 weeks into their arrangement. The chickens had been restless for days, and Elias had found tracks near the coop. A coyote, bold and hungry. He took his old rifle from its pegs on the wall one evening as dusk began to bleed across the sky. "Stay inside," he told Joe, his voice flat. "Bolt the door behind me." She was washing the dinner plates. She looked up, her hands still in the soapy water, and simply nodded. But as he stepped out into the cooling air and made his way toward the coop, a sixth sense told him he wasn't alone. He glanced back. She was standing on the porch, a silhouette against the warm lamplight of the cabin, her arms crossed. He frowned, but didn't have time to argue. A low growl from the shadows near the fence line confirmed his suspicions. He raised the rifle, trying to get a clear sight on the lean, gray shape slinking through the tall grass. The coyote was clever, staying just out of a clean shot. It darted left, then right, a ghostly blur in the fading light. Elias cursed under his breath, adjusting his aim. The animal was about to make a dash for the coop's weak side. He never fired. From the porch, there was a sound he couldn't place, a soft shhhk of leather, a crisp, metallic click. It was followed by a deafening crack that was sharper, faster than his own rifle's report. The coyote yelped once and collapsed in a heap, motionless. Elias stood frozen, the rifle heavy in his hands. He slowly lowered it and turned to look at the porch. Jo was standing in the exact same spot, but her posture had changed. She was no longer a farm wife, she was a predator. In her right hand, held with a familiarity that chilled him to the bone, was a Colt Peacemaker. It hadn't been there a second ago. He hadn't seen her draw. It was as if the gun had simply materialized in her grip. Smoke curled lazily from the barrel in the twilight air. He stared at her, then at the dead coyote, then back at her. The shot had been perfect, taken from 30 yards in poor light. It wasn't a lucky shot. It was the shot of an expert. He walked back to the cabin, his boots heavy with 100 new questions. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her expression grim. She didn't try to hide the pistol. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice quiet but hard. "My father," she said, her own voice tight. "He taught me. For protection. That's more than protection, Jo. That's something else." She finally looked down at the gun in her hand, as if seeing it for the first time. With a deft, practiced movement, she uncocked it and slid it back into a hidden holster he now saw was strapped to her thigh, concealed by her skirts. The sight of it was more shocking than the shot itself. "I didn't want you to know," she said, her gaze lifting to meet his. Fear flickered in their depths, a genuine fear he had never seen in her before. "I knew you wanted someone simple. I tried to be simple." Elias looked at this woman, this beautiful, capable, dangerous woman who had just saved his chickens with the lethal grace of a seasoned gunman. He should have been angry. He should have been scared. He should have packed her valise and put her on the next train heading anywhere but here. He had traded his last savings for a partner, not a walking, breathing secret with a hidden gun. But as he looked at her standing there, vulnerable in her deception, all he could think about was the steadiness of her hand and the fear in her eyes. He had ordered a simple farm wife. What he had gotten was infinitely more complex. And for the first time, he realized his problem wasn't the mortgage or the drought. It was the woman on his porch and the terrifying fact that he wasn't going to ask her to leave. He just nodded slowly, a silent, unwilling acceptance of the mystery. He turned and went to fetch the coyote's body, leaving her alone on the porch with her secrets and her gun. The storm hadn't broken. It had just moved closer. The incident with the coyote changed the air between them. An unspoken truth now lay on the table with their supper plates each night. She could handle a gun better than he could, and they both knew it. The pretense of her being a helpless mail-order bride was gone, replaced by a cautious, watchful respect. Elias found he didn't mind. In fact, a part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, was relieved. The land was hard, and life was unforgiving. Having a partner who was a survivor, truly a survivor, was a comfort he hadn't known he needed. They fell into a new rhythm, one built on shared labor and growing familiarity. He taught her how to read the clouds for rain and how to brace a fence post so it would hold against a winter storm. She, in turn, showed him a way to reshoe Clementine that didn't strain the old mule's back, a trick she claimed to have learned from a traveling blacksmith he didn't press for details. He began to see the woman beneath the gunslinger's guard. He saw it in the way she gently tended a sick calf, her voice a low murmur as she bathed its fevered head. He saw it in the rare, unguarded smile that would touch her lips when his clumsy dog, Buck, would drop a slobbery stick at her feet. These moments were fleeting, but they were like finding a spring in the middle of the desert. They gave him hope. Jo, for her part, began to relax in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. The rigid set of her shoulders softened. She stopped scanning the horizon with such desperate intensity. Elias's quiet steadiness was a balm to her frayed nerves. He was a good man. He worked from sunup to sundown without complaint. He was kind to his animals. And though he now knew she was more than she seemed, he had not sent her away. He had treated her with the same gruff respect as before. She had spent years looking over her shoulder, and for the first time, in this quiet, isolated place, she felt a fragile sense of peace. She started to think of the small cabin not as a hiding place, but as a home. The thought terrified her more than any bounty hunter. One afternoon, while they were repairing the roof of the barn, a loose shingle sent Elias sliding. He landed hard, his arm twisting beneath him with a sickening crack. Pain, white-hot and sharp, shot up to his shoulder. He lay on the ground, gritting his teeth against a wave of nausea. Joe was down the ladder before he could even register what had happened. She knelt beside him, her face a mask of controlled concern. "Don't move," she ordered, her voice calm and authoritative. Her hands were gentle but firm as they probed his arm. "It's broken. A clean break, I think." She helped him to his feet and half carried him back to the cabin. With surprising strength, she got him settled in a chair. "I'll need to set it," she said, her eyes meeting his. "It's going to hurt." He just nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. She worked with a physician's efficiency, tearing strips from a clean sheet for a sling and fashioning a splint from pieces of a broken crate. She gave him a strip of leather to bite down on. "Ready?" The pain when she pulled the bone into place was excruciating, a blinding flash of agony that made him cry out against the leather. But it was over in a second. She worked quickly, binding the splint tight, her touch sure and steady. When she was done, she wiped the sweat from his brow with a cool, damp cloth. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked through clenched teeth, the words almost identical to the ones he'd spoken after she'd shot the coyote. A shadow passed over her face. "You pick things up, living on the road." It was the closest she'd ever come to admitting her past was one of movement and hardship. For the next few weeks, their roles were reversed. With his arm in a sling, Elias was largely useless for heavy farm work. Joe took over everything. She hauled the water, mucked the stalls, plowed the small field for late-season planting, and still managed to cook and clean. She worked with a grim determination that exhausted him just to watch. He saw the toll it was taking on her, the deepening shadows under her eyes, the way she sometimes slumped into her chair at night, too tired to eat. One evening, he sat watching her try to mend a tear in her own dress, her fingers fumbling with the needle after a long day's work. A wave of guilt and a fierce, unfamiliar emotion washed over him. He got up and walked over to her. He gently took the needle and fabric from her hands. "Let me," he said quietly. His mother had taught him to sew a straight stitch. His work was clumsy compared to hers, but he was patient. He sat beside her in the quiet lamplight, slowly mending her dress while she watched, her expression soft and unreadable. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the small sounds of the needle pulling thread, the crackle of the fire, and their breathing. In that moment, he wasn't a rancher and she wasn't a gunslinger. They were just two people, finding solace in a shared, quiet space. The outside world intruded a week later. Elias had to ride into Redemption for supplies. Joe insisted on going with him, her eyes holding that old, watchful tension again. "It's not safe for you to ride with one arm," she'd said. But he knew it was more than that. She didn't want to be left alone. The town felt different with her by his side. Men stared openly now, their gazes a mixture of awe at her beauty and suspicion. The women whispered behind their hands as she passed. Elias felt their judgment like a physical weight and steered her protectively toward the general store. Inside, while Elias was giving his order to the proprietor, Sheriff Brody came in. He was a big man with a drooping mustache and eyes that missed little. He tipped his hat to Elias, but his gaze settled on Joe. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Haven't seen you in town since you arrived." "I've been busy," Joe replied, her voice polite but cool. "I'm sure," the sheriff said, his eyes lingering on her. "Had a U.S. Marshal through here last week. Asking questions. Looking for a woman. Said she was armed and dangerous. Rode with the Black Creek gang for a spell. Woman named Josie Galloway." The name hung in the air, thick and heavy. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. Josie. He looked at Joe. Her face was a perfect, pale mask, but he could see the frantic beating of a pulse in her throat. Never heard of her, Joe said, her voice steady as a rock. Sheriff Brody grunted, not looking convinced. Well, if you see a woman who looks a lot like you but answers to Josie, you be sure to let me know. He gave them both a long, hard look before turning and leaving the store. The ride back to the farm was colder than the journey in. The silence was back, but this time it was jagged and full of unspoken accusations. Josie the ghost, a member of the notorious Black Creek gang. Robbers. Killers. When they got back to the cabin, Elias couldn't hold it in any longer. He stood in the middle of the room, his good hand clenched into a fist. Is it true? Joe stood by the door, her back to him. She didn't turn around. Yes, the word was barely a whisper. You're a bank robber? An outlaw? I was, she said, her voice strained. My father raised me in it. It was the only life I ever knew. But I left. I swear, Elias, I left it all behind. Why? His voice was raw. He felt like a fool. He'd brought a wanted criminal into his home. She finally turned to face him, and he was shocked to see tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Because they killed a family, she said, her voice breaking. During a stagecoach robbery. A mother and her boy. They weren't supposed to get hurt. Fletcher, the leader, he said it didn't matter. But it mattered to me. I couldn't do it anymore. I took what money I had and I ran. The matrimonial society, it seemed like the only way to disappear. To become someone else. He stared at her, at the raw pain and regret etched on her face. This was the secret she had been guarding so fiercely. This was the source of the shadows in her eyes. He saw the woman who had set his arm, who had worked until she dropped to save his farm, who smiled at his clumsy dog. And he saw the outlaw she had been. The two images warred in his mind. He was scared. Scared of the law, scared of the Black Creek gang who would surely be looking for her, scared of the violence she was running from. But as he looked at her, trembling but defiant, a deeper fear eclipsed all the others, the fear of losing her. He had ordered a simple life, but this complicated, dangerous, and fiercely decent woman had woven herself into the fabric of his. They'll come looking for you, he said, the words a statement of fact, not an accusation. I know, she whispered. I should leave. I'll pack my things. I won't bring this trouble to your door. She turned toward her valise, but he crossed the room in 2 strides and put his good hand on her arm, stopping her. She looked up at him, her moss-green eyes wide with surprise. No, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You're not leaving. This is your home now. A tear slipped from her eye and traced a path down her cheek. Elias, you don't understand. Fletcher won't just let me go. They'll kill you to get to me. Then we'll face them, he said, the words tasting strange and bold in his mouth. We'll face them together. In that moment, standing in the middle of his humble cabin, holding the arm of a wanted outlaw, Elias Thorne made a choice. He chose the chaotic, perilous future with her over the simple, lonely past without her. He chose the woman, not the idea. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his life would never be simple again. The waiting was the hardest part. Every dust cloud on the horizon was a potential threat, every snap of a twig in the night a cause for alarm. Joe taught Elias how to shoot, not just to aim. She showed him how to reload his old rifle quickly, how to use cover, how to listen to the silence of the plains. He was a clumsy student compared to her, but he was determined. During the day, they worked the farm with a frantic energy, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But at night, they sat by the fire, cleaning their weapons, the unspoken tension a third presence in the room. The bond between them deepened, forged in the crucible of shared fear and mutual reliance. The physical space in the small cabin seemed to shrink, while the emotional space between them evaporated entirely. One night, after a particularly grueling day of reinforcing the barn doors, she looked up from cleaning her colt, her expression somber. You should have let me go, Elias. It's too late for that, he said simply, not looking up from oiling his rifle. You're my wife. The word felt solid, real. It wasn't just a term of convenience from a mail-order contract anymore. It was a declaration. She looked at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the guard in her eyes fell away completely, replaced by a profound, heart-stopping tenderness. "I'm not," she said softly. "Not legally. Not in the eyes of God. You are in mine," he replied. And in the quiet of the cabin, that was enough. They came on a Tuesday, under the brassy glare of a late afternoon sun. For riders, appearing as dark specks on the eastern ridge before resolving into hard-faced men. Joe saw them first. She was drawing water from the well, and her body went rigid. "Elias," she called out, her voice low and urgent. "They're here." He came out of the barn, a hammer in his hand. He looked east, and his face set into grim lines. There was no panic. They had prepared for this. "Get inside. Or the door." "I'm fighting with you," she stated, her hand already resting on the butt of her holstered pistol. "You'll do more good from the window. They won't expect 2 guns. It was sound logic. She nodded once, her eyes locking with his for a long, meaningful moment. Then she disappeared inside the cabin. Elias took his position behind the water trough, his rifle resting on the edge. The riders approached slowly, confidently. The man in the lead was tall and wore a black duster, a cruel sneer on his face. This had to be Fletcher. He reined in his horse just out of easy rifle range. "Josie." Fletcher's voice was a gravelly roar that carried on the wind. "I know you're in there. Come on out. We have business to discuss." The cabin remained silent. Buck, the dog, let out a low growl from under the porch. "Don't be like that, girl." Fletcher laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "We just want what's ours. The money you took. And you're coming back with us. Your farmer friend here can live, if he's smart." "This is my property," Elias called out, his voice clearer and stronger than he'd expected. "My wife is not going anywhere. Turn your horses around and ride out." Fletcher's sneer widened. "His wife?" he bellowed, turning to his men. "Did you hear that? Josie the ghost, settled down as a farm wife. Who's the bigger fool, boys? Her for thinking she could hide, or him for thinking he could keep her?" One of the men laughed and raised his rifle, aiming it casually at Elias. "Let's just kill him and be done with it, Fletch." Before the man could finish his sentence, the front window of the cabin exploded outwards. A gunshot, sharp and loud, echoed across the yard. The man with the rifle cried out, dropping his weapon as he clutched a shattered shoulder. All hell broke loose. Fletcher and his other 2 men spurred their horses and scattered, firing wildly at the cabin and at Elias. Splinters flew from the water trough as a bullet slammed into the wood near Elias's head. He returned fire, the recoil of the rifle jarring his newly healed arm. He wasn't aiming to kill, just to keep them back, to make them think twice. But Joe was aiming to disarm. Another shot rang out from the window, and a pistol flew from another outlaw's hand. He howled in pain and surprise, his fingers mangled. They had expected a cornered, frightened girl and a simple farmer. They had found a fortress defended by a ghost and a man made of iron. "Damn you, Josie," Fletcher roared, taking cover behind his horse. He was furious, his plan unraveling. He'd underestimated her, and he'd completely underestimated the farmer. The standoff was brutal but brief. Elias's steady, suppressing fire kept them pinned, while Joe's impossibly precise shots neutralized them one by one. The final man went down when a bullet from her Colt tore through his thigh, sending him tumbling from his saddle. Only Fletcher was left. He stared at his wounded men, then at the small, defiant cabin. The fight was gone from him, replaced by a look of pure, venomous hatred directed at the window. He knew he was beaten. With a final curse, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, a lone figure disappearing back over the ridge. Silence descended, thick and ringing. The only sounds were the groans of the wounded men and the frantic panting of Buck. The cabin door creaked open. Joe emerged, her pistol still held at the ready, her face pale but resolute. She surveyed the scene, her eyes cold and professional. Elias rose from behind the trough, his rifle smoking. He walked to meet her in the middle of the yard, the space between the house and the barn that they had just defended with their lives. They stopped in front of each other, the dust settling around them. The wounded men were moaning, trying to crawl away. "I'll tie them up," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "Take them to the sheriff in the morning. Testify against Fletcher." Joe just nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. The coldness in them began to melt, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and overwhelming relief. She took a shaky breath, and the hand holding the pistol trembled. He reached out, not with his good hand, but with his mended one, and gently took the heavy Colt from her grasp. He uncocked it and set it on the porch rail. Then he cupped her face in his hands, his rough farmer's palms gentle against her skin. "It's over," he whispered. "Yes," she breathed, leaning into his touch. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Not as Josie the ghost, the feared outlaw, or Josephine Galloway, the mysterious mail-order bride. He saw Jo, his Jo, the woman who had fought for their home, for their life. He had ordered a simple farm wife, a transaction of necessity. But what he had found was a partner, a warrior, a woman whose strength matched the unforgiving land they lived on. He had found his heart. "I ordered a simple farm wife," he said, a small, wry smile touching his lips for the first time that day. "Seems I got more than I bargained for." A genuine, radiant smile broke across her face, transforming her. It was like the sun breaking through after a week of storms. "No," she said, her voice soft but sure as she placed her hand over his on her cheek. "You got a partner." He lowered his head and kissed her, there in the dusty yard, surrounded by the wreckage of her past and the foundation of their future. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of profound gratitude and deep, abiding certainty. It was a kiss that sealed a pact made not with a contract, but with gunpowder and courage. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they stood together on the porch. The outlaws were tied up in the barn, awaiting the sheriff. The air was still and cool. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her gun belt hung on a peg inside the door, her hands now free for other things. He wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her close. They looked out over their land, the fields, the barn, the endless sky. It wasn't the simple life he had planned. It was messy, and it had been dangerous. But as he stood there, with Jo by his side, he knew it was infinitely better. It was real, and it was theirs. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.